The morning sun over Manhattan didn't just rise, it performed for Arthur Pendelton. It glinted off the chrome of his $4 espresso machine and cast long, sharp shadows across the white marble of his kitchen island. Arthur stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 42nd floor penthouse, adjusting the silk lapels of his navy dressing gown. To anyone else, the city below was a chaotic hive of noise and grit. To Arthur, it was a ledger, and he was currently in the black. Arthur was a man of curated experiences. Every item in his home, from the mid-century modern lounge chairs to the rare first edition Hemingway on his shelf, served a singular purpose: to remind him that he had arrived. He was a hedge fund manager who didn't just move money, he moved mountains. Or so he told himself every morning while sipping his ultra-dark roast. The silent hum of the penthouse was broken by the soft, rhythmic thunk swish of a vacuum cleaner in the hallway. That was Elena. Elena had been Arthur's domestic manager. He hated the word maid for 3 years. She was a fixture of his life, as reliable as the sunrise and just as quiet. She was a woman of indeterminate age, perhaps in her late 50s, with salt and pepper hair tucked into a sensible bun and a wardrobe that consisted exclusively of variations of a charcoal gray uniform. She was the ghost that erased his spills, the phantom that replenished his organic blueberries, and the shadow that ironed his charvet shirts to a razor edge. Arthur rarely spoke to her beyond technical instructions. "The silver needs polishing, Elena," or "I'll be hosting a gala on Thursday, please ensure the crystal is spotless." She would nod, offer a polite, "Yes, Mr. Pendelton," and vanish back into the task at hand. He viewed her with the kind of distant, benevolent pity one might feel for a stray cat that had been successfully domesticated. Today, however, the routine was broken. As Arthur sat at the Marble Island to check his morning trades on his iPad, Elena didn't move to the kitchen to begin the dusting. Instead, she stood at the threshold of the room, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Her knuckles were white. "Mr. Pendelton," she whispered. Her voice was thin, vibrating with a tremor he had never heard before. Arthur didn't look up from his screen. "Yes, Elena. If it's about the dry cleaner, I've already authorized the payment." "It's not that, sir," she said. She took a step forward, her sensible orthopedic shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. I find myself in a very difficult position. A family emergency. In Europe." Arthur sighed, his thumb pausing over a stock ticker. Here it comes, he thought. The request for a week off. Or perhaps a small advance on her salary. He felt a flicker of annoyance, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of self-importance. He was a wealthy man. He could afford to be gracious. "Go on," he said, finally looking up. He practiced his concerned boss face, the one that suggested he was both powerful and deeply empathetic. Elena swallowed hard. "I need money, sir. A significant amount. More than I could ever save on my wages. My nephew, there is a legal matter involving a family estate. If it isn't resolved by the end of the month, everything my family has worked for will be lost." Arthur leaned back, crossing his legs. "I see. And how much are we talking about, Elena?" "1,000. 2. Elena looked him in the eye for the first time. There was a strange intensity there, a depth he hadn't noticed in 3 years. $50,000, Mr. Pendelton." The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur actually let out a short, sharp laugh before he could catch himself. 50,000? Elena, that's more than your annual salary. That's a down payment on a house in the suburbs. It's a luxury SUV. I know what it is, sir, she said quietly. And I know what I am asking. I have no collateral. No bank will talk to me. But I have worked for you for 3 years. You know I am reliable. I will sign a contract. I will work for you for the next 10 years for free. I will work every weekend. I need the liquidity now. Arthur stared at her. $50,000 was, to him, the price of a mid-range watch or a particularly lavish weekend in St. Bart's. It was a rounding error in his personal portfolio. But to the woman standing before him, a woman who took the bus and probably shopped at discount grocers, it was a fortune. It was a life-altering, impossible sum. He felt a sudden, intoxicating rush of power. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the asymmetry of the situation. He was the god of this small universe. With a single stroke of a pen, he could rescue this poor, desperate woman from the brink of ruin. He could be the hero of her family's story. 10 years is a long time, Elena, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a paternal, soothing register. He stood up and walked over to his mahogany desk in the corner of the living room. I wouldn't want to turn you into an indentured servant. I am desperate, sir, she repeated. Arthur pulled out his checkbook, the heavy, gold-embossed ones he kept for special transactions. He felt a warm glow of charity. He imagined himself telling this story at the club later. My maid was in a bind, needed 50 grand for some family crisis. I just wrote the check. Couldn't let the poor thing suffer, you know? It's just money, after all. He liked the version of himself that was the generous benefactor. He liked the idea of Elena being eternally indebted to his kindness. He scribbled the figures, $50.000.00. He signed his name with a flourish, Arthur P. Pendelton, the ink still wet and glistening on the paper. He tore the check from the book with a satisfying rip. He walked back to her and held it out. Elena's hands shook as she took it. She stared at the check as if it were a holy relic. Don't worry about the 10-year contract, Elena, Arthur said, placing a hand on her shoulder in what he thought was a comforting gesture. We take care of our own here. Just keep the silver polished and the espresso stocked, and we'll call it even for now. Pay me back when you can, or don't. I won't lose sleep over it. Thank you, Mr. Pendelton, she whispered. Her head was bowed, her face hidden from him. You have no idea what this means. You really have no idea. Think nothing of it, Arthur said, already turning back to his iPad. He felt magnificent. He felt like a king. He didn't notice that as Elena turned to leave the room, her shaking hands suddenly stilled. He didn't see the way she tucked the check into her pocket with a practiced, clinical efficiency. And he certainly didn't see the faint, enigmatic smile that played on her lips, the smile of a woman who had just completed a very successful social experiment. Arthur Pendelton went back to his trades, convinced he was the most important person in the room. He was wrong. He was currently the second richest person in the room, and he didn't even know he was being outplayed. The week following his act of grand mercy was perhaps the most self-satisfied week of Arthur Pendleton's life. He walked with a bit more spring in his step, his chin tilted just a few degrees higher. In the circles of high finance, power was usually measured by how much you could take from others. Arthur found a perverted, exhilarating sense of superiority in how much he could give. Every time Elena silently refilled his water or placed a freshly laundered shirt on his bed, he felt a warm, golden glow. I saved her, he thought. I am the foundation upon which her family's survival rests. He had already recounted the story anonymously, of course, to a few colleagues over Wagyu steaks and vintage Bordeaux at the Gilded Cage. One must look after the help, he'd said, swirling his glass. Stability at home ensures stability in the portfolio. His peers had nodded in solemn agreement, toasting to his old-school values. However, the golden glow began to flicker on a Tuesday morning, exactly 7 days after he had signed the check. Arthur was in his home office, a room paneled in rare Macassar ebony and smelling of expensive leather. He was staring at 3 monitors displaying the flickering red and green heartbeat of the global markets when his private line rang. It was Marcus, his lead accountant and the man who kept Arthur's various shell companies and offshore trusts in a state of legal, if questionable, equilibrium. "Arthur," Marcus said. His voice was unusually tight, stripped of its usual professional calm. "We have a situation with the Vanguard Urban Development portfolio." Arthur frowned. Vanguard was his fortress investment, a collection of prime Brooklyn real estate and luxury condos. It was the bedrock of his personal wealth, a multi-million-dollar stake that provided a steady, ironclad yield. "What kind of situation?" "The market is up 2%. "Not the market, Arthur. You. Or rather, your position. Someone just triggered a forced buyout clause in the partnership agreement. A majority override. I didn't even know that clause existed in the 2021 bylaws, but apparently, if a single entity acquires 65% of the voting shares, they can liquidate minority holders at the current market valuation. No negotiation. No right of first refusal." Arthur felt a cold prickle of sweat at the base of his neck. 65%? "Marcus, I own 15%. The rest is fragmented among a dozen different hedge funds. No one has 65. "Someone does now," Marcus snapped. "An entity called Valerius Holdings has spent the last 48 hours snapping up every fragment. They paid a 20% premium over market price just to reach the threshold. They've squeezed you out, Arthur. Your shares are being liquidated as we speak. You'll get the cash, but you've lost the asset. You've lost the seat at the table." "Who the hell is Valerius?" Arthur demanded, his voice rising. "I know every player in the city. I know the Rockefellers, the Graysons, the Chinese sovereign funds. No one has ever heard of a Valerius. They're a ghost, Arthur. A private family office. No website, no PR firm. Just a series of interlocking trusts based in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. Whoever they are, they just took your crown jewel because they felt like it." Arthur slammed his hand onto the desk. The sheer audacity of it burned. To be moved like a pawn on his own board was an insult he couldn't stomach. "Find them, Marcus. I want a name. I want to know who thinks they can push a Pendelton out of the Vanguard." He hung up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He needed the physical Vanguard files. He keep a backup of the original physical contracts in a fireproof safe in the office, but his desk was a mess of recent reports. He began tossing papers aside, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. That was when he saw it. Near the heavy industrial shredder in the corner of the room sat a plain, unassuming manila folder. It looked out of place in a room filled with embossed leather binders. It was the kind of folder you'd find in a public school or a government social services office. Arthur assumed Elena had found it while cleaning and left it there for him to inspect. Perhaps it was a bill he'd overlooked. He snatched it up, intending to toss it into the to-sort bin, but a stray piece of paper fluttered out. He picked it up from the rug. It wasn't a bill. It was a Schedule K1, Form 1065. Arthur's eyes, trained by 15 years of financial warfare, scanned the document automatically. He expected to see a medical bill for a nephew or a legal summons for a family estate. Instead, his brain registered numbers that didn't make sense in the context of a maid's life. Entity name, Valerius Holdings, LLC. Partner name, Elena V. The rest of the name was blurred by a coffee stain, but the Elena was unmistakable. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. He sat down heavily in his executive chair, his hands trembling as he opened the folder properly. Inside was a treasure trove of financial documents that no domestic manager should possess. There were tax returns from the previous year. There were bank statements from private Swiss firms that required a minimum balance of $10 million just to open an account. But it was the most recent document, a wire transfer confirmation, that stopped his heart. It was a confirmation for a transfer of $50. The sender was Arthur Pendelton. The recipient was an account labeled Valerius Petty Cash, Liquidity Bridge. Arthur stared at the words until they began to swim. Petty cash. He looked at the dates. The transfer had been initiated the same day he had given Elena the check. Attached to the wire confirmation was a handwritten note on a yellow post-it, in Elena's precise, elegant script. Bridge loan secured. Temporary liquidity gap closed while the Cayman audit clears. Proceed with the Vanguard acquisition. Minority holders are to be cleared by Friday. The room seemed to tilt. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't the generous benefactor. He wasn't the hero of the story. He realized with a sickening clarity that the family emergency Elena had mentioned wasn't a tragedy, it was a technicality. Her wealth was so vast, so complex, and so heavily shielded in offshore accounts that a routine audit had temporarily frozen her liquid cash in New York. She hadn't needed $50 to save a nephew's life, she had needed it to pay a filing fee or a closing cost for a multi-million-dollar hostile takeover. The $50 he had graciously bestowed upon her was the final penny she needed to buy the very company that had just crushed him. He thought back to her trembling hands. He thought back to the tremor in her voice. It had been a performance. An Oscar-worthy portrayal of a desperate woman, designed to play exactly on his arrogance, his need to feel superior, and his predictable desire to play the savior. He looked around his penthouse. The marble, the silk, the ebony, it all suddenly felt like a dollhouse. He had spent 3 years treating the most powerful person he'd ever met like a servant. He had lectured her on how to polish silver while she was likely calculating the EBITDA of his entire life's work. A soft sound came from the doorway. Arthur froze. He didn't look up. He knew that sound. It was the soft thunk swish of a vacuum cleaner. Mr. Pendelton. Elena's voice called out from the hall. It was the same thin, polite voice he had heard every day for 3 years. I've finished the guest rooms. Would you like your lunch served in the office or the dining room today? Arthur looked at the folder in his hands. He looked at the $50 bridge loan confirmation. For the first time in his life, Arthur Pendelton was truly, deeply afraid of his maid. He realized that he didn't just owe her the truth, he owed her rent. Because if she had the power to liquidate his Vanguard shares on a whim, she probably already owned the building he was sitting in. The office is fine, Elena, he managed to choke out, his voice sounding like a stranger's. Very well, sir, she replied. He heard her footsteps retreating. They weren't the hurried steps of a servant. They were the measured, rhythmic steps of a woman who owned the world, and was simply waiting for the rest of it to catch up. Arthur Pendelton did not sleep. He spent the night pacing the length of his ebony-paneled office, the manila folder sitting on his desk like an unexploded pipe bomb. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the wire transfer confirmation, $50, petty cash. The words mocked him. They stripped away the layers of his carefully constructed identity as a titan of industry and left him feeling like a child playing dress-up in his father's suits. He watched the sun crawl up the glass of the Chrysler building, but the warmth did not reach him. At 7 a.m., the familiar, soft click of the service entrance echoed through the penthouse. Elena was back. He stayed in his office, door cracked just an inch, watching her through the gap. She went about her business with a terrifying, robotic normalcy. She brewed his coffee, the expensive beans he'd bragged about, and set out a bowl of hand-picked berries. She moved with the silent grace of a ghost, her gray uniform crisp and anonymous. How could a woman who controlled billions of dollars spend her morning scrubbing a bachelor's backsplash? It was a perversion of the natural order. Or, Arthur realized with a jolt of nausea, it was the ultimate luxury, the power to be nobody. At 10 a.m., Elena approached his office door and knocked twice. Mr. Pendelton? I've prepared your lunch for later. As it is Wednesday, I'll be taking my scheduled half-day now. Is there anything else you require before I depart? Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. No, he managed, his voice sounding thin and brittle even to his own ears. No, Elena. Enjoy your afternoon. Thank you, sir. I shall see you tomorrow morning. He waited. He listened to the sound of her changing in the small staff locker room near the pantry. He heard the service door close. The second it clicked shut, Arthur was moving. He threw on a nondescript trench coat and grabbed the keys to his Porsche 911, not the flashy red one, but the midnight black one he usually kept for low-profile meetings. He didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs down 2 flights to the guest parking garage, then caught a different elevator to the street level. He emerged into the mid-morning humidity of Manhattan just in time to see Elena walk out of the building's main entrance. She wasn't heading for the bus stop. Arthur stayed half a block behind, his pulse racing. He expected her to disappear into the subway or hail a yellow cab. Instead, Elena walked 3 blocks north, her stride lengthening, her posture shifting from the slightly slumped gait of a domestic worker to something sharp, rhythmic, and purposeful. At the corner of 57th and Park, a sleek, ink-black Maybach S-Class sat idling at the curb. The windows were tinted to a mirror finish. As Elena approached, the driver, a man in a suit that cost more than Arthur's car, stepped out and stood at stiff attention. He didn't just open the door, he bowed. Not a subservient bow, but a gesture of profound, institutional respect. Elena stepped into the back of the car without a word. The door closed with a heavy, pressurized thump that spoke of bulletproof glass and reinforced steel. Arthur scrambled into his Porsche, his hands slick with sweat. He followed the Maybach as it wound its way through the serpentine traffic of Midtown, heading south toward the financial district. He felt like a stalker, but the curiosity was a physical ache in his chest. He needed to see where the maid went when the apron came off. The Maybach pulled into the private underground garage of the Valerius Tower, a glass and steel monolith that pierced the sky like a needle. It was the headquarters of the Valerius Group, the very entity that had just decapitated Arthur's real estate holdings. Arthur couldn't follow her into the private garage, so he parked illegally in a loading zone and sprinted into the main lobby. The atrium was a cathedral of minimalist wealth, white marble, silent fountains, and security guards with earpieces who looked like they'd been recruited from special forces units. He stood near a large digital directory, pretending to check his phone. A group of men in high-end Italian tailoring rushed toward the private elevator bank, looking anxious, checking their watches. They were joined by a woman who Arthur recognized immediately from the cover of Forbes, a venture capitalist known for her ruthlessness. They were all waiting for someone. The private elevator dinned. The door slid open. Arthur's breath caught. Elena stepped out. She was gone. In her place stood a woman who radiated a cold, crystalline authority. The gray uniform had been replaced by a charcoal gray Chanel power suit, the fabric shimmering with a subtle, expensive sheen. Her hair, usually pinned in a tight, frumpy bun, was now styled in a sleek, architectural bob. Around her neck was a string of South Sea pearls, each the size of a marble. "The board is waiting, Madame Valerius," the venture capitalist said, falling into step behind her. Elena didn't slow down. She moved through the lobby like a predator in its natural habitat. "Tell them they have 10 minutes, she said, her voice no longer thin or trembling. It was a rich, commanding contralto that echoed off the marble walls. "If the merger isn't signed by noon, I'm withdrawing the bridge loan and letting the subsidiary collapse. I have no patience for indecision today." "Of course, Elena," the man replied, scribbling notes on a tablet. Arthur watched from behind a giant potted fern, his world spinning. "Madame Valerius." The name rang through his head like a funeral bell. He remembered the rumors now, the shadow queen of Wall Street, a reclusive billionaire who had inherited a shipping empire and turned it into a global apex predator. No one knew what she looked like because she never did interviews, never attended galas, and never allowed her photo to be taken. She had been in his house for 3 years. She had cleaned his toilets. She had seen him in his underwear. She had listened to his arrogant phone calls, his boasts about crushing the competition, and his complaints about the price of caviar. And then, she had asked him for a loan. Arthur felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in his throat. The $50. It wasn't about the money. To Elena Valerius, $50 was the equivalent of a nickel found in a couch cushion. She had asked for it to see if he was capable of a single, unvarnished act of human kindness. She had given him a test of character that cost less than the watch on his wrist. He had passed the test, yes. He had given her the money. But he had done it with such condescension, such a bloated sense of charity, that the victory felt like a defeat. He had treated her like a beggar while she was his landlord. He watched her disappear into a glass-walled conference room on the mezzanine level. Through the transparency, he saw 20 of the most powerful people in the city stand up as she entered. She took her seat at the head of the table, and with a single gesture of her hand, they all sat. Arthur walked out of the building into the bright, unforgiving light of the afternoon. He felt small. Not just financially small, but spiritually microscopic. He realized that Elena hadn't just been his maid, she had been his audience. His entire life for the last 3 years, the posturing, the wealth, the success had been nothing more than a private performance for a woman who could have bought and sold him 1,000 times over. He returned to his Porsche and sat there for a long time, the engine idling. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. They were the hands of a man who thought he was a king, only to realize he was a court jester. He knew what would happen next. Tomorrow morning, at 8 a.m., the service door would click open. Elena, or rather, the woman playing the character of Elena, would walk in, put on her gray apron, and ask him if he wanted his eggs poached or scrambled. The thought terrified him. How do you look a goddess in the eye when she's holding a duster? Arthur gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The game wasn't over. He had passed the first test, but the real challenge was just beginning. He didn't just want to know who she was, he wanted to know why. Why him? Why his apartment? And most importantly, what did she plan to do with the man who thought he was her master? He shifted the car into gear and drove back toward the penthouse, his mind racing. He had one advantage, she didn't know he knew. Not yet. The morning air in the penthouse felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a catastrophic tectonic shift. Arthur Pendelton sat at his kitchen island, his fingers interlaced so tightly they had turned a ghostly white. In front of him sat a cup of Jamaica Blue Mountain coffee, the steam rising in a lazy, mocking spiral. He hadn't touched it. He couldn't. Every time he looked at the dark liquid, he saw the reflection of the Valerius Tower, and the woman who had stepped out of the Maybach. At 8 a.m. sharp, the service door clicked. Arthur's heart did a slow, painful roll in his chest. He heard the familiar sounds, the rustle of a heavy coat being hung up, the soft patter of orthopedic shoes, and then the sound of the gray linen apron being tied at the waist. It was a symphony of deception. Elena walked into the kitchen. She looked exactly as she had for the last 3 years, modest, efficient, and utterly unremarkable. She held a feather duster in one hand and a spray bottle of organic glass cleaner in the other. "Good morning, Mr. Pendelton," she said. Her voice was back to that thin, deferential tone. "You're up early. Is the coffee to your liking? I noticed you haven't taken a sip." Arthur looked at her. He looked at her hands, the hands that had smoothed his bed sheets, the hands that had accepted his $50 charity, and the hands that, as of yesterday, had effectively seized control of his most valuable assets. "The coffee is fine, Elena," he whispered. His voice was hoarse. "You look pale, sir. Perhaps a touch of seasonal flu? I can prepare some ginger tea with manuka honey if you'd like." She moved toward the pantry, her movements fluid and practiced. "Elena, stop." She paused, her hand hovering over the cabinet handle. She didn't turn around. "Sir. I was at Park Avenue yesterday," Arthur said. The words felt like lead weights dropping onto the marble floor. "I was at the Valerius Tower. I saw the black Maybach. I saw the security detail." The silence that followed was absolute. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow to a roar. For 10 seconds, Elena didn't move. She stood perfectly still, a gray statue in a golden cage. Then, she did something Arthur had never seen. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She slowly retracted her hand from the cabinet, turned around, and placed the spray bottle on the counter. She reached behind her back, untied the knots of her gray apron, and pulled it over her head. She folded the apron neatly precisely and laid it across the back of a bar stool. When she looked up, the maid was gone. The woman standing before him had the same face, the same salt and pepper hair, but her eyes had changed. They were no longer dull and subservient, they were twin chips of flint, radiating an intelligence so sharp it felt like a physical pressure in the room. She didn't wait for him to speak. She pulled out the bar stool opposite him and sat down. This was a breach of every house rule Arthur had ever established, but the rules no longer existed. The walls of his reality had been stripped away, revealing a much larger, much more dangerous world. "I wondered how long it would take you to follow me," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave, losing its thinness, gaining the rich, commanding resonance he had heard in the lobby. "I must say, Arthur, your investigative skills are nearly as clumsy as your market hedging." Arthur flinched. "Who are you?" "You already know the answer to that," she replied, leaning back and crossing her legs. "I am Elena Valerius. I am the chairwoman of the Valerius Group. And for the last 3 years, I have been the woman who makes sure your socks are matched and your blueberries are fresh." "Why?" Arthur exploded, his frustration finally breaking through his fear. "You're a billionaire. You probably have more liquid capital than half the firms on Wall Street combined. Why would you spend 3 years scrubbing my floors? Why would you play this sick game?" Elena picked up his coffee cup, the one he hadn't touched, and took a small, elegant sip. She made a slight face of disapproval. "It's a bit cold. You should really drink it while the oils are active." She set the cup down. "It isn't a game, Arthur. It's an observation. When you sit at the top of a skyscraper, everyone lies to you. Your lawyers lie to preserve their retainers. Your advisors lie to keep their bonuses. Your friends lie because they want to be seen with you. You live in a hall of mirrors where everyone reflects back exactly what you want to see." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "But people don't lie to the maid. To you, I was a piece of furniture. I was a background process. You spoke freely on the phone about your conquests. You showed your true temper when a dry cleaner missed a spot. You showed your true character when you thought no one of importance was watching." Arthur felt a cold wave of shame. He remembered 100 conversations, boastful, arrogant, sometimes cruel, that he had had while Elena was in the room. He had discussed hostile takeovers, mocked the little people who lost their pensions in his trades, and laughed about squeezing the lemon of the market until it bled. "And the loan?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling. "The $50,000. You didn't need that. You bought my Vanguard shares for 10 times that amount an hour later." "That was the final exam," Elena said. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, not quite kindness, but perhaps a clinical sort of respect. "I wanted to see if there was a shred of humanity left in the man who manages millions. I created a scenario, a desperate woman, a family crisis, a bridge that only you could cross. I wanted to see if you would help someone who could offer you absolutely nothing in return. No prestige, no networking, no profit. And I gave it to you," Arthur said defensively. "I wrote the check." "Yes, you did," Elena agreed. But you did it with the air of a man throwing a bone to a stray dog. You did it to feel superior. You did it to reinforce your own myth. However, you did do it. Many in your position would have simply fired me for bringing my drama into their home. You chose to be a benefactor. It was a clumsy, arrogant kindness, Arthur, but it was kindness nonetheless. Arthur put his head in his hands. So, what now? You've liquidated my Vanguard shares. You've proven I'm an arrogant fool. Are you here to serve me my final meal before you bankrupt me? Elena let out a short, dry laugh. Bankrupt you? Arthur, I don't care enough about your portfolio to destroy it. Taking Vanguard was business. It was a strategic asset my group needed for a larger play in Brooklyn. Your 15% was just in the way. She stood up. The power in the room shifted with her. She looked around the penthouse, her gaze lingering on the art and the marble. I'm done cleaning your floors, Arthur. The experiment is over. I find that I no longer have the patience for the gray apron. But I haven't cashed your check. In fact, I've done something else with it. She reached into the pocket of her slacks and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. She slid it across the marble toward him. What is this? That is the key to a small office on the 68th floor of the Valerius Tower, Elena said. It's currently empty. I'm looking for a junior partner. Someone who knows how the sharks think, but who still has enough of a soul to write a $50,000 check to a maid in need. Arthur looked at the key, then back at her. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you an education, Elena corrected. I'm going to teach you how to move mountains without making a sound. I'm going to teach you that the most powerful person in the room is often the one holding the duster. If you want it, be at my office tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. She walked toward the service door, but paused at the threshold. She turned back, a ghost of a smile on her face. And Arthur? If you're late, don't bother coming. I've always been very strict about punctuality with my staff. It would be a shame if I had to fire you on your first day. She stepped through the door and was gone. Arthur sat in the silence of his multi-million-dollar penthouse, staring at the brass key and the folded gray apron. The tea was cold, the coffee was bitter, and for the first time in his life, Arthur Pendelton realized he didn't know anything about power at all. The following morning, the alarm clock did not sound like a herald of victory, it sounded like a summons to a tribunal. Arthur Pendelton lay in his Egyptian cotton sheets, staring at the ornate molding of his ceiling. For the first time in his adult life, he felt a profound sense of vertigo. His kingdom was still there, the art, the view, the luxury, but it felt like a stage set after the play had finished. The leading lady had walked off, and the director was nowhere to be found. He rose and walked into the kitchen. It was spotless, but cold. There was no smell of freshly ground beans, no rhythmic sound of a duster against wood. The silence was deafening. He looked at the bar stool where Elena had sat the day before, leaving her gray apron behind like a shed skin. Arthur walked to his dressing room. He stood before a row of 50 suits, each a masterpiece of tailoring. Usually, he chose his attire based on who he intended to intimidate that day. Today, he felt like the one being scrutinized. He reached for a charcoal power suit, then hesitated. He remembered her parting words, "Wear the blue tie. It looks more professional." He found a deep cerulean silk tie, a shade he usually avoided because it felt too traditional. As he knotted it in the mirror, he realized he wasn't dressing for a board meeting, he was dressing for an audience with the person who had dismantled his entire worldview in under 24 hours. At 8:45 a.m., Arthur stood before the Valerius Tower. From the street, the building looked like a shard of obsidian plunged into the heart of Manhattan. He approached the security desk, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Arthur Pendelton to see Madame Valerius," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The guard, a man with the build of a linebacker and the eyes of a hawk, checked a digital manifest. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask for a reason. He simply tapped a button on his console. The private express elevator is to your left, Mr. Pendelton. Floor 68. She is expecting you. The elevator ride was silent and nauseatingly fast. When the doors slid open, Arthur expected a bustling hive of activity, phones ringing, traders shouting, the frantic energy of a billion-dollar firm. Instead, he stepped into a space that felt more like a library or a cathedral. The floors were polished dark wood, the walls were lined with original Rothkos and Picassos, and the only sound was the low, distant hum of the city's air filtration system. A young woman in a sharp blazer met him. "This way, Mr. Pendelton." She led him past glass-walled offices where people worked in focused, library-like silence. Finally, she stopped before a set of double doors made of reclaimed oak. She opened them without a word. Elena Valerius was sitting at a desk that looked like a solid slab of petrified wood. Behind her, the entire south-facing wall of the building was a single sheet of glass, offering a view of the Statue of Liberty that made Arthur's penthouse view look like a postcard. She was wearing a cream-colored silk blouse and reading a physical file, a pair of elegant reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the page, made a neat note in the margin with a fountain pen, and then closed the folder. 9 o'clock sharp, she said, removing her glasses. Punctuality is the first step toward discipline, Arthur. And you chose the blue tie. Good. It brings out the color of your eyes, makes you look more trustworthy, which is a trait you'll need to cultivate. Arthur walked into the center of the room. He felt the vastness of the space, the sheer weight of the wealth concentrated in this one office. I'm here, Elena. Or Madame Valerius. I'm not sure which one I'm speaking to. In this office, I am the chairwoman, she said, gesturing to a chair opposite her. But between us, let's keep it to the names we've used for 3 years. It reminds us both where we started. She pushed a manila folder toward him. It was identical to the one he had found near his shredder. Your first assignment, she said. Arthur opened it. He expected to see a complex spreadsheet of real estate holdings or a hostile takeover strategy for a rival bank. Instead, he saw a series of photographs of a dilapidated textile mill in a small town in Pennsylvania. There were lists of names, employees, many of them in their 50s and 60s. There were balance sheets that showed a company drowning in debt, struggling against cheap overseas competition. Hopewell Textiles, Arthur read aloud. He frowned. I've heard of them. They're a relic. Their market cap is practically non-existent. Why are we looking at this? If you want to liquidate them for the land, it's a minor play. Elena leaned back, her eyes narrowing. That is exactly how you used to think, Arthur. You see a dying beast and you think of the meat on the bones. You see the land play because that's what a shark sees. But look closer at page 4. Arthur flipped the page. It was a patent filing for a new type of carbon fiber weave, developed by an engineer at the mill. It was a breakthrough in lightweight, fire-resistant material, something the aerospace industry would pay billions for. They don't know what they have, Elena said. The management is old-fashioned. They're focused on making curtains and bedspreads. They're about to declare bankruptcy. A dozen firms are circling them like vultures, waiting to buy the equipment for scrap. And what do you want me to do? I want you to save them, Elena said. I want you to go down there, not as a representative of Valerius Holdings, but as an independent consultant. I want you to convince them to pivot. I want you to protect that patent from the vultures. And I want you to do it without using a single dollar of my money as a bribe. Arthur stared at her. You're joking. How am I supposed to save a bankrupt mill without capital? The same way I managed your household for 3 years, Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. By listening. By understanding the people who actually do the work. By being invisible until the moment you need to be seen. You have the $50 I never cashed. Consider that your operating budget. She reached into her desk and pulled out his original check. It was wrinkled, but the signature was clear. She slid it across the wood. This check was born of an arrogant desire to be a hero, she said. Now, I want you to use it to actually be one. If you can turn Hopewell around, if you can save those jobs and secure that patent, then you'll have earned your seat at this table. If you fail, you can go back to your hedge fund and spend the rest of your life wondering why a maid was smarter than you. Arthur picked up the check. He looked at the paper, then at the woman who had become his mentor, his tormentor, and his greatest challenge. The power dynamic had shifted completely. He wasn't her employer, and he wasn't quite her employee. He was her student. Why me, Elena? He asked. You could send 100 Harvard MBAs to do this. Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city she essentially owned. Because the Harvard MBAs only know how to look at the numbers, Arthur. They don't know what it's like to be at the bottom of the mountain. You've spent 3 years with me. You've seen the world through my eyes, even if you didn't know it. You've seen that the person cleaning the floor sees more than the person sitting in the chair. She turned back to him, her face illuminated by the morning sun. I don't need another shark, Arthur. I have plenty of those. I need someone who knows how it feels to lose everything, and who still has the courage to write the check. Now, get out of my office. You have a train to catch to Pennsylvania. Arthur stood up. He tucked the check into his pocket, the cerulean blue tie straight, his shoulders square. He didn't feel like a titan anymore. He felt like a man with a heavy burden, and a long road ahead. Elena. He said at the door. Yes, Arthur. Who makes your coffee now? A genuine, warm smile broke across her face, the first one he had ever seen. I make it myself, Arthur. It's the only way to ensure the oils are properly active. Arthur nodded, a small smile of his own tugging at his lips. He walked out of the office, through the library silent halls, and into the elevator. As the doors closed, he didn't look at his reflection in the mirrored chrome. He looked at the floor, clean, polished, and full of the secrets of the people who walked upon it. The maid was gone. The billionaire remained. And for Arthur Pendleton, the real work was finally beginning.